and welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Today we look at labour mobility. Do we need more of it or less of it? The US government is trying hard to get net migration down to tens of thousands. President Trump is, of course, building a wall to keep the Mexicans out. And Scott Morrison, who's Australia's latest Prime Minister, is looking for a plan to get migrants to settle outside capital cities, exactly where the jobs aren't. Generally, it seems many people take a dim view of migration. But is it good or bad for the economy? Does it need to be controlled? Are open borders reckless? Or are there benefits of a planet perhaps with complete labour mobility? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. So do migrants become a burden on taxpayers, or do they add to the productivity of a nation? If there was room, if people from poor countries move to rich countries, then some reckon that the world GDP would double. I mean, it would be a bit crowded, property would be bloody expensive, but on paper at least, the economy would grow. That is never going to happen, of course. One of the reasons so many people voted for Brexit was because they wanted to take control of our borders, just as John Howard said in Australia all those years ago, that we'll decide who comes here and the circumstances in which they come. And the world seems now even more concerned with reducing labour mobility rather than encouraging it. So, Steve, is this a good thing, reducing labour mobility, or is it a bit of a step backwards?
I'm actually in favour of it being less mobility, but understanding why the mobility is actually happening. Because, if you have a plentiful supply of workers of any sort coming into an economy, it's going to affect the bargaining power of workers. It's going to be something which reduces their capacity to bargain.
So you think it does drive wages down?
I think there's validity to the argument.
Has that happened though? I mean, if the it doesn't look like it's happened in the UK. We're not. Well, I guess we've seen wages stagnate since the global financial crisis. But that's not a period when we've seen significant increase in migration to the UK. It actually was, before the global financial crisis when wages were going up.
Yeah, but I think the whole extent to which you've got a global labour force competing with itself has been to the benefit of the people at the top rather than down at the bottom. So there's far more mobility of, capitalism, but in terms of monetary capital is by far the most mobile thing you can have. You can transfer money almost instantaneously. But workers are the ones who've moved physically, and that's in terms of productive resources. That's the workers have been shifting from one country to another, normally moving from a third world country to a first world country. And that has effectively been part of why workers have gone backwards in bargaining power over where they were in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
There was less migration and more of a national workforce, and the organisation of the workforce through unions as well, which have also been abolished.
But isn't it more? That's more to do with the power of the unions rather than the number of people from overseas, isn't it? I mean, if there was the right regulations in place that said, look, if there's no jobs, you can't come here, then presumably people wouldn't, if they couldn't get easy access to welfare, then presumably they wouldn't come here. So then it's going to be self-regulating to an extent, isn't it? You're just going to make sure you've got
not when you've got the push factor at the other side. I mean, if you're worried about being a victim of, violence, a Tamil victim of violence, state violence in Sri Lanka, you're going to leave you're going to leave on the hope and a prayer rather than, there's no jobs over there, I won't try. And equally, if you're a climate refugee in Syria, when apparently a large part of the internal movements in Syria have been due to declining rainfalls and declining water supplies for farming.
They've got more to worry about than that, though. I think it's more than they're being bombed.
They then get bombed out of the cities and they then migrate to the west. So we're suffering a large amount of series of breakdowns. And even though, in general, I'm in favour of refugee resettlement, but in favour of free movement of labour for the sake of looking for a job somewhere else. Now, I'm not in favour of that because it's actually effectively weakened the bargaining power of workers. It's made a global market in labour in a way that you don't quite have a global market in terms of industrial productivity. The industries.
But why not? I mean, if you had that global market of both, free movement of people and capital, which obviously is what the European Union has been trying to do, if you extended that on a global scale, and people went where the jobs were and the jobs went where the people were, you'd have a more fluid system. That would have to be a good thing, wouldn't it? Ultimately, whether it's practical or not, in theory, it would be a good thing.
What you start seeing is actually a depopulation occurring and a concentration of both industry and capital in boom sectors and a elimination of them elsewhere. I gave a couple of speeches in Croatia 1 or 2 years ago, drove from Zagreb down to Pula, which is where I was speaking, and we went through several villages where I just noticed it was unusually quiet. And my driver and companion said, "Oh, there's nobody living here anymore. They've all migrated to the European Union, or migrated to the cities as well." And what it meant was, of course, everything was decaying. There's nobody living there, nobody investing there, nobody maintaining anything, and the places are actually falling into a state of decay. So in some ways, you want to have a dispersal. You don't want to necessarily have you want a dispersed population to some degree. You don't want a concentrated one.
I'm not sure I entirely agree with Steve Keen on all of this. And in fact, this is just the first part of a longer interview. If you want to hear it in full, then you have to become a subscriber to debunkingeconomics.com. Go to debunkingeconomics.com and choose one of the subscription options on the website on the right-hand page. Or you need to be a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. If you choose a support package of $10 or more per month, then you get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series. So hopefully we'll see you back here for the full edition of this episode, and we'll catch you again very soon. Thanks for listening.